Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, first of all, just again, my thanks to the National Silk Museum and the director, Joe Fong, in particular, for inviting me to speak here today. Yeah, today I'm going to talk about the Tang Shipwreck Gallery. It's also known as the Belatung Wreck. I think in Chinese you call it the Heshu Hao. Excuse my pronunciation, and in or the Batu Hitam wreck in Indonesian. Actually, I realized that compared to all the other talks, I think one of the differences here is this is actually a permanent gallery, a permanent exhibition of a silk route, or actually I call it Curating Maritime silk routes. Actually, this is more of a ceramic route. We use the term silk route because it's catchy and so forth, but what's being shipped by sea is mainly ceramics. We do think there was probably silk on this ship as well, but of course it wouldn't survive. It wouldn't survive underwater, silk being a perishable material. But definitely in terms of the maritime routes, we're looking, I think, more at ceramic. Does this work? All right. Just a little bit about our museum. Yeah, we have, I think there's been this question today that everybody's been talking about, how do you relate to your audiences? And of course, this is extremely pertinent and important. Being a museum in Singapore, Singapore is a multicultural, multi-religious city-state. So it's very important for us to reflect that in our collections and in how we arrange our galleries. So we really look at interconnections, connections with the world, and it's really Asia through the lens of Singapore. Singapore, of course, even today is a global trading hub, global finance hub. It's a multicultural global city. It couldn't really exist in isolation. So again, this is one of the things we try and hook the Singapore public into looking at Asia through this lens as well. And we've talked a bit about hybridity today. Some of our other speakers have talked about this, which is great. It sort of foregrounds what we do at the museum. We moved away when the museum was first set up. It was done geographically, so we had a China gallery, a Southeast Asia gallery, a India gallery, and so forth. But we really found that somewhat restrictive, and particularly with our sort of what we want to do with the museum. So now we've organized it thematically. And we look at networks and flows much more than borders and boundaries. And I think you can see from these two examples on the screen, the Changsha Bowl on the far side. This is from the Tang Shipwreck. If you look at what's depicted, it's a makara. It's this mythological sea creature, and it's a Hindu-Buddhist motif from India that spreads out into Southeast Asia and also into China. The piece here on this side, on my right, is also a makara, but it's from Malaysia, and in this context, it's used in a Islamic circumcision ceremony. So you can see that even in Southeast Asia, for example, motifs that were originally Buddhist or Hindu have over time become Islamicized. So again, this idea of cultures being fixed and pure, maybe when we actually start looking more deeply at the layers, we can see that there's a lot of hybridity and synchronism. And we do this through a lot of our galleries. We look at hybrid forms. We don't just look at east-east, so connections between Asia, but also east-west, so particularly in terms of the colonial period. If you look at the piece in the center, it really sums up, again, I think what hybrid art is. It's the horse is Chinese. It's a Chinese porcelain. The two cups that make the incense stand are Japanese, and the mounts are French. So again, where do you place an object like this if you have geographical galleries? It doesn't quite work. Again, the Virgin and Child is a Sri Lankan example, but if you look at the style of it, it almost looks much more like a Buddhist bodhisattva. That's because the workmen carving it are usually trained in Buddhist art. So again, if we start looking carefully at these objects, we can see a lot of mixing and intermingling. So that's really what our museum is about in a nutshell. We have 3 floors. The first floor is trade, the second floor is faith, and the third floor is design. And so trade and faith, different religions of Asia, essentially go hand in hand as well. All of the religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, and later Islam, all spread throughout the world, usually along trade routes, and sometimes, a lot of time, piggybacking on the back of trade. So let's turn our attention to the Tang Shipwreck. The Tang Shipwreck is actually the first gallery that the visitor enters in our first floor. And so it's a really great example of being able to sort of straight away tell that story of global trade, this time in the 9th century. And it is really a question, this is a shipwreck. The ship itself is a Middle Eastern ship. It sails all the way to China in the 9th century. It picks up a Chinese cargo that's tailored for the Middle East, and it's heading back when it sinks in Southeast Asia. So again, where would you place a permanent gallery like this if your galleries are done geographically? You're never going to do justice to the full story, and I think that's what we try and do here at the gallery. Yeah. I was very lucky because I had a dry run at this because, as John had pointed out earlier, we set up the gallery in 2015, in November 2015, but before that we lent the show to the Aga Khan Museum. So John Volmore, who was the guest curator, did a really fantastic job with it. He went through it earlier. And this was really, really great for me because it gave me a chance to see the collection laid out and sort of look at how John had approached it and so forth. So yeah, I would if you have a chance to, if you're thinking of a new permanent gallery, I think one way of doing that is to try and do a special exhibition first, and then you can really get some ideas and iron out some of the kinks. So this is the gallery at ACM. This is what you see. Slightly different to what John did. I think it was really important, again, when we look at, of course, we are curating for the public. We curate for our peers as well, but it's really important that the public, what messaging are we getting across? I think we really wanted the impact of the idea that this is a shipwreck and to talk about globalization or global trade and hybridity in the 9th century. So what we did, we broke it up into about 5 sections. The first part deals with the discovery and the excavation, and I think somebody was saying earlier on about how the public really react to discoveries and how things are found and the sort of sense of mystery or romance. So I think that's always, never leave that out of your exhibitions. These are sometimes some of the most interesting stories that the public will really gravitate to, and that's kind of your hook then to get them in to look at some of the more academic issues that we may want to discover or talk about. Yeah, life on board. It's interesting as well. A lot of people ask about the crew, and human stories are really important. I think that's something I've learned as well, is that if you can get a personal dimension and a human dimension in there, the general public get more interested as well. And I think it was interesting earlier about I haven't seen the exhibition that's on here right now, but it seems like you've done it through 10 personalities as well. So I think that's definitely a good way to go forward. Of course, then we do go into the ceramics. The ceramics are extremely important. They make up the majority of the wreck, and they can tell us a lot. But at the same time, when we were setting this gallery up, it was really important to us that this not come across as a gallery of Chinese ceramics. And no offense to the audience here, I know we all love our Chinese ceramics, but that's really not the messaging here. And so, whereas it's great for scholars to look at these ceramics, and we can learn a lot as art historians and archaeologists from them, for the public it's more about the overall story of the shipwreck and why was this cargo important and so forth. There was some luxury items on board. We've seen one of them already. And then the 5th point is really another important point that we're trying to get across, which is artistic interactions and this sort of hybridity of culture. Trade does not happen in a vacuum. It's not a one-way street. You need at least 2 or 3 partners to have trade, right? So if no one's going to buy your product, you can't sell it. So in the storage. This is what this is sort of a mock-up of how we're visualizing it. Yes, Maria mentioned maps before as well. Yeah, it's really important, I think, especially when we're talking about these scales in terms of maritime routes as well. So the first thing that the public sees and views is a map that really shows the extent of the trade routes and also the route that the ship took and where it sank and so forth. Also, the global cultures at that time that are driving this trade route. Of course, you've got Tang, China on one side, and you've got the Abbasid Empire on the other. And these are the two poles, right? If you don't have that, then the trade network is not going to work. And then you have all these extremely important cultures in between, in India, and particularly in Southeast Asia. The kingdom of Srivijaya essentially controlled the straits through which every ship that moved between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea would have to sail past. We then introduced them to the actual recovery method of the shipwreck. Again, this is something the public are very interested in, sort of archaeology, discovery, so forth. There is debate among archaeologists and a certain amount of controversy in terms of how this shipwreck was recovered. Again, we discussed this and we're quite open about it. And these are things that we shouldn't shy away with the public. These are things that we should engage with. We should raise problems. We should actually point out when things are disputed. And the public, again, engage with that, and then they can draw their own conclusions. So again, I think sometimes as museums, we can have a tendency to be a bit defensive. But in terms of, these are very pertinent issues in the museum world and in popular culture in general. So we should really, we should embrace them. This is sort of one of the first displays you see in terms of conservation and the state. This is one of the most popular displays in the museum. This is what they see next. Everybody wonders, right, how do you get about 70,000 ceramics into a ship that's only 18 meters long? And this is how they did it. This is sorry, I should have the photo credit. This is a photograph taken at the excavation from Michael Flecker, who was the archaeologist in charge. And you see they use this helix, this coiling technique, which is referred to in Chinese literature as well. And we've reconstructed it in the gallery, and people are, again, quite fascinated by this. Yeah, the ship is really important as well. One of the interesting things about the Tang shipwreck is we don't, if you go to quite a lot of shipwreck museums, like the Shinan shipwreck in Korea, for example, or the Vasa in Sweden is another very famous one, they have the ship. They in terms of the Vasa, they have the complete ship. They literally resurfaced it. But they don't have much. The Vasa is interesting. It doesn't have much cargo, but it has the ship. The Shinan wreck, they've reconstructed and they've recovered a lot of the hull, and they have the cargo. With the Tang shipwreck, we don't have the ship itself. So the archaeologist and Tom Vosmer, who was a maritime archaeologist, reconstructed the ship and then made ship models of it. So that's how we address that as well. And the ship's important because that's how we know it's a Middle Eastern ship, because of the technique in terms of its construction. It was sewn together. The planks are sewn together. There's not one single nail or dowel used. This is a specific technique used in the Arab world, in Persia, and in Gujarat in India. So again, it's important to emphasize that. Yeah, the international crew, which is an interesting way of sort of, again, framing this. Who owned it, who was shipping it. And again, we try and look at different objects to tell the story. We know it's a Middle Eastern ship, but it has a Chinese cargo. So we presume that the captain and the crew, at least, would be at least Persian or Middle Eastern. But they may have been Chinese merchant on board. They may have, the cargo may have been done by consignment. He may have been there to oversee it. And we definitely have evidence for Southeast Asians on board as well. Does this pointer work? Oh, okay, great. Yeah, okay, so these are, some of you may be familiar with them. These are what's sometimes called Basra wares. They're earthenwares, and they come from the Middle East, and these are very classic Middle Eastern wares. There was only 3 of them left on the shipwreck, and then a glass bottle as well, also Persian. This is an inkstone, so clearly Chinese, and a bracelet as well. This is a Sumatran mirror. This is a common type you find. And again, I mentioned Srivijaya. This is the civilization that the monkey Jing visited in the 7th century. Srivijaya was a Buddhist kingdom that controlled the straits. So again, it's not unusual that we would find this material here. And it's probably that, you know, the crew would have been replenished along the way, and they may have been most probably crew from this region, Malays or Austronesians, who are helping to navigate the Southeast Asian sections. Yeah. The other amazing thing I think that about the Tang shipwreck and that scholars, amazed scholars, when it was found is the quantity of ceramic. I mean, this really shows mass production in the 9th century. You know, the scale of production at the Changsha kilns is quite remarkable. But it presents a curatorial challenge. John sort of came up with one way of dealing with it in his exhibition, but how do you get across that mass of objects? How do you, obviously we can't show 50,000 ceramics in a gallery, but so we came up with this sort of wave design and, you know, to emulate the sea and so forth. Also in terms of your audiences, maybe we're all a little bit older, but Instagram or Instagrammable shots is very important now in museum setups. In China, I guess you have WeChat. So again, you know, trying to think of ways in which the public will interact differently these days in an age of social media. Yeah, and the motifs, I've talked about this as well. These are made in China in the Changsha kilns, but it's really interesting is they're tailoring their product for a Middle Eastern market. This motif here, I think most of you would agree, is not particularly Chinese. It looks like a pomegranate tree, and the Changsha bowl on the far side here, it looks like Arabic calligraphy. Some of it's not actually calligraphy, it just sort of emulates Arabic calligraphy. So it looks like the Chinese potters or working at the kilns were sort of approximating what it looked like. But it does appear that some of the works are, some are actually readable as Arabic in certain examples. Yeah, back to geography. I think if you just talk to the public about kilns in general, they get pretty bored pretty quickly. But actually, if you show them that, you know, there's all these different kilns where all of this material comes from, and then they sort of realize the logistics of having to ship it all the way to, whoops, sorry, it's the point of working, there we go. All right, all the way to, we think the ship left from Yangzhou, or either Guangzhou, but either way, it would have, all of the ceramics would have had to have been accumulated at this site. And then I think, you know, the public get interested, they start wondering, how do you move all this ceramic around and so forth. There is, of course, you know, sort of classic Tang Dynasty ceramic on there as well. It's the minority, but it's there. So we do, of course, feature it as well. But again, what we do try and show is the exchanges. This one highlighted in red is not from the Tang shipwreck. It's from the Abbasid Empire. This is an Abbasid piece, and you can see they're trying to copy the Chinese whitewares, but of course they can't get the same quality because they don't have the same clay and the same kaolin and so forth. But you know, so you can see this exchange of ideas going back and forth in terms of ceramic design and production. The green splashware as well, the one in the center again is a Middle Eastern piece. And you know, the pieces on either side, you know, when scholars first saw this material in the sort of 1930s and so forth, they didn't think it was Chinese. They thought it was maybe Middle Eastern. Now we know that this is produced in China. But again, it seems like it's produced for an export market. I think most of you in the audience would probably know better than me, but as far as I know, this is not commonly found in tomb sites and so forth in China. And of course, this is probably the most famous three examples from the Belatung shipwreck, the Tang shipwreck, is the blue and white. So again, I don't need to tell anybody in this room, of course, that blue and white, Chinese blue and white really starts taking off in the 13th century. But here we have examples from the 9th century. But what's interesting, of course, is that the motifs on them are not in any way Chinese. They're Middle Eastern. These are lozenge and palmette motifs here. Oops. Yeah, here and here. And this is a better example. So again, this one is not from the Belatung wreck. This one is an example from the Middle East. This one's from the Belatung wreck. So you can see clearly, right? You can see the influence. You can see here what the Chinese are trying to approximate what they're trying to copy. So again, you know, trade always goes, it's multi-directional. It's never one way. So you have sort of China sending products to the Middle East sending products back, and then there's this sort of hybridity and sort of exchange of ideas and motifs between these two pieces. Again, I'm not quite to get the blue color, of course, you need cobalt. My understanding is in the 9th century that cobalt is mainly coming from the Middle East. But I have been told recently that it may have been also mined in China at this period. Again, I'm happy to hear people's opinion on this. But if this is the case and it's coming from Iran, then you have the cobalt being shipped out to China, China producing this ceramic and then sending it back. So again, if that's not a definition of globalization, I don't know what is. So yeah. Yeah, and this is just how they're on display in the museum. All right, and I think I'm out of time. This is the very last piece. Thankfully, Maria actually showed the gold cup that I think you're all quite familiar with earlier. And again, you know, the connections of the overland Silk Route with metalworking is very clear, and I think she showed an excellent example of that. This is, again, one of the other gold dishes. There were 7 pieces of gold from the shipwreck. Again, it's an interesting one because, of course, the gold or the metalworking technique comes along the overland Silk Road from the Sogdians, from the Sasanians. The Chinese start to develop this tradition, and by the 9th century, it's quite Sinicized, it's quite Chinese in its design, and you can see the swastika motif in the center, of course, is Buddhist, and then they're sending it back. So again, you know, these flows, you know, keep coming back and forth. And again, that's something we keep trying to emphasize and re-emphasize in our gallery. Yep, and that's pretty much it. Thank you.